Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating stack of sources.
Yeah, sources that offer a pretty bold critique of India's current constitution.
And they don't just critique, they propose something entirely new. We've got excerpts from this book, New Democratic Republic Constitution for India, by Dr. Ryan Bhatia.
Right, and a review of that book, plus various images, articles, appendices. It's quite a collection.
It really is. And the sources paint Dr. Bhatia as quite multifaceted, a writer, art enthusiast, entrepreneur, educator.
And you can see his focus, even in his other book titles mentioned, like She Is, seems to be on inequality, education, and, well, structural change.
Absolutely. That definitely comes through here. So our mission, let's unpack this, is to explore this critical look at the existing Constitution, understand the history, and influences the source points to.
And then really get into the details of this proposed new constitution and the reforms it suggests.
Exactly. It's about understanding the source's argument for, well, fundamentally reimagining India's legal framework.
It really asks you to question if the current setup, despite its ideals, justice, liberty, equality, is still too tied to colonial legacies decades later.
So let's jump right into that core critique. The source argues straight away that the current Constitution, maybe despite being this beacon of hope,
might not be fully delivering on those core ideals. It might still be tangled up in its colonial origins.
And the book's premise is quite direct about this.
Very direct. It argues for revisiting, maybe completely reimagining the Constitution, making it more reflective of India's own values, traditions, aspirations.
It questions if that colonial shaping ever really let India reach its full sovereign potential.
Precisely. And it gets specific about where it sees failures. Let's start with the idea of India as a socialist republic.
Right. The source argues it hasn't truly lived up to that part of the preamble.
Well, it points to a few things. India's mixed economy, right? Significant private sector involvement.
Not state control.
Not really, and especially post-1991 liberalization, privatization, that reduced the state's role quite a bit.
Okay.
Then there's a growing wealth inequality. The source really highlights this gap between rich and poor.
And access to services.
Unequal access, yeah.
Yeah.
Education, healthcare.
Yeah.
The source says this contradicts socialist principles. Plus, private sector dominance in key areas, less state control overall.
So, the word's there in the preamble, but the economic reality, according to this source, is different. What about being a fully effective democratic republic?
Here, the criticisms focus on the electoral system itself.
How so?
The first past-the-post system, for one. The source argues it leads to disproportionate representation, winning a majority of seats without a majority of votes.
Right.
Then there's the influence of money, muscle power in elections. Big concerns. The lack of proportional representation is also mentioned, potentially sidelining smaller groups.
And beyond just the voting.
Yeah, the source brings up political dynasties, corruption, issues that undermine the democratic ideal. And it also critiques what it sees as weak checks and balances. Institutions like the judiciary, media, regulators, potentially being undermined or influenced.
Right.
Plus, concerns about restrictions on civil liberties. It mentions specific laws like sedition, UAPA, NSA, and ongoing issues of discrimination and social inequality.
That's a pretty comprehensive critique of the democratic functioning. Now, the secular republic part, the source gets quite detailed there.
It does, and it's, well, quite contentious. The argument is, even though secular was added to the preamble.
By the 42nd Amendment, right?
Yes. But the source argues that implementation through laws, court decisions, government actions has often seemed to favor certain religious communities.
How did the source support that claim? What examples does it give?
It points to personal laws. Separate laws for Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis on things like marriage, inheritance.
The source sees that as contradicting uniformity.
Exactly, contradicting equality before the law. It also mentions perceived preferential treatment, citing things like the old Hajj subsidy or state funding for pilgrimages as example.
Okay, what else? There was something about education.
Yes, Article 28 bans religious instruction in state schools, but Article 30 gives minorities the right to run their own educational institutions.
Right.
The source frames this as an imbalance, arguing the Hindu majority doesn't have a similar right for state-funded institutions promoting their beliefs, seeing it as unequal.
And the control over temples.
That's the HRCE Act, the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act. It puts Hindu temples and their finances under government control.
which isn't the case for mosques or churches.
According to the source, no. They don't face the same state oversight of property and finances. So the source presents these points, impartially we should say, as areas where the constitutional framework is perceived to fall short of true secular equality in practice.
Right, reporting these impartially is key, given the sensitivity. Okay, so that covers the critique of the present. Let's shift gears and look at how the sources trace the history, the influences that shapes the current Constitution.
The sources trace this path towards self-governance through key British legislative reforms. They start with the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919.
And the sources even show images of Montagu and Chelmsford.
Yeah, it helps visualize it. Then comes the Government of India Act, 1935. That introduced provincial autonomy, proposed a federal structure.
Though it wasn't fully implemented that way.
Right. Then the Cabinet Mission Plan in 46, sketching out independence with a weak center and the Constituent Assembly idea.
And finally, the Independence Act of 47.
Which led to partition, dominion status, recognizing King George VI, there's an image of him too, and the formal transfer of sovereignty.
It sounds very procedural, but the source has a specific take on the British strategy here.
It does. The source suggests the British were deliberately appeasing the non-violent Congress movement.
Gandhi's movement.
Yes, because they favored negotiation, while at the same time undermining the armed resistance movements like those involving Bhagat Singh, Raj Bahari Bose, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose.
And the claim is Congress got preferential treatment.
The source claims that, yes, because their approach fit better with a managed transfer of power from the British perspective.
That's certainly a distinct historical interpretation, and Netaji Bose and his Azad Hind government feature quite heavily in this narrative.
Very heavily. The sources detail its structure, 19 departments, its own bank, currency, court, anthem, civil code. It highlights Bose mobilizing Indians in East Asia for the INA.
And the INA's military action.
Yes. And the source strongly concludes that not fully recognizing Bose's role or clarifying what happened to him is a, quote, national shame.
Moving to the actual drafting of the Constitution. Who were the key players, according to the source, and what were their influences?
The focus is on the drafting committee, chaired by Dr. Ambedkar. He's called the principal architect.
And his background is highlighted.
Yes, his education at Columbia, London School of Economics, other members too, Ayar, Munshi, Mitter, Khaitan, are noted as being educated within the British system, and B.N. Rao, who prepared an initial draft based on other constitutions.
And the source's critical angle on this.
The argument is that these individuals, though patriots, were deeply shaped by their Western education and legal training within the British framework.
So the conclusion is
that this led to a constitution that largely copied the systems of the former colonial rulers, creating what the source calls a foreign ideological base for India, rather than one rooted in indigenous traditions.
It even tries to quantify that influence.
It does. It estimates roughly 40-50% British influence, 20-30% U.S., then smaller chunks, 5-10% each from Irish, Canadian, Australian models.
And the source sees those others as derived from the British model anyway.
Largely, yes. It mentions specific things, too, like emergency provisions from Weimar Germany and the 1935 Act being influential.
So based on this estimate, how much came from ancient Indian traditions?
Very little, according to the source, maybe 5-10%. Mostly in local governance, like panchayats and some ethical principles.
Which leads the source to conclude it's predominantly foreign.
That's their conclusion, yes, based on those estimates.
A significant claim. The sources also bring up the Indian Penal Code.
Right, the IPC, drafted in 1860 by the British. The source argues it was designed to control Indians, extract wealth.
And its continued use, even in modified forms like the new BNS.
The source sees that as a big question mark over India's true sovereignty. Was the break from colonial legal structures really complete?
And the final point on origins. The Constitution wasn't truly by the people.
The argument centers on how the Constituent Assembly was formed. Members were indirectly elected by provincial assemblies.
And those assemblies weren't elected by everyone.
No, far from it. They were elected under the 1935 Act's limited franchise based on property, education, tax status.
So who was left out?
A huge portion of the population. The source notes only 10-15% could vote then. So most women, lower castes, the poor, they had no say.
And no final vote on the Constitution itself.
No direct referendum for the whole population. The source calls this a democratic deficit, highlighting the exclusive nature of a process dominated by elites.
Okay, so the source links this history and these influences directly to the problems it sees in the current Constitution. Let's pivot now to the source's view on India's indigenous governance traditions and reclaiming history.
Right. The sources talk about India's ancient past, Bharat, as this ancient civilization with rich traditions, knowledge, legal systems.
And the economic claim.
A striking claim, yes, that Bharat was the world's largest economy, over 30% of global GDP before foreign invasions, starting around the 11th century. There's a chart in the source showing this sharp decline.
And the source links that dominance to governance.
Yes. It attributes it to what it calls fair and equitable systems of governance.
What about the Vedic system specifically?
The source acknowledges the Rig Veda isn't a modern democratic manual, but it interprets elements as supporting collective decision-making. The focus is on the Rajan, the ruler.
As a servant.
As a servant of the people, a guardian. Expected to be just, watchful, protect people, listen, uphold dharma duty, righteousness, not just dominate.
And specific verses are cited.
Yes, from the Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Atharva Veda, interpreted as showing ethical leadership, accountability, public welfare principles. The source sees these as precursors to democracy, arguing the current constitution only gives them limited space, like with panchayats.
The source uses an analogy, too, about roots.
The tree analogy, yeah. Deep roots give stability. Connectedness to historical and cultural roots gives resilience to a nation and its people. Stronger identity, collective strength.
But the source claims this connection has been intentionally weakened, a historical deprivation.
This is central to their argument. They claim that since 1947, there's been a systematic dilution, manipulation, even cover-up of history, especially from the 11th century to the British Raj.
And the impact of this alleged deprivation
Disconnects people from their roots, leads to potentially lower self-esteem, weaker identity, less social cohesion, maybe even lower productivity.
And specific historical figures and periods are used as examples.
Yes, recounting the source's perspective impartially. Mogul figures like Akbar, often glorified, but the source notes his conquests involved coercion. Aurangzeb, often seen negatively for intolerance.
Right.
The source notes his administrative efficiency, but also how he alienated non-Muslims. It's about highlighting what it sees as selective histories.
And the British Raj.
Presented as a period of intense economic exploitation, the drain of wealth, the Bengal famine of 1943, specifically mentioning Churchill's role, social disruption through divide and rule, the 1905 Bengal partition, and cultural suppression, promoting English education, Western values.
And Netaji Bose comes up again here.
Yes, his case is presented as a key example of this alleged historical cover-up. His role with the INA, the mystery around his death in 1945.
Question the plane crash theory.
Yes, mentioning alternative theories, the Mukherjee Commission findings, criticizing governments for not declassifying files. Again, the source calls the failure to resolve his fate and recognize his role a national shame.
And to fix this perceived historical imbalance, the source have concrete proposals.
It proposes celebrating December 30th, the INA Formation Day, as a unifying national holiday honoring diverse freedom fighters, not just the nonviolent movement.
And the proposal for August 15th.
Quite provocative. It suggests making August 15th, Independence Day, a day of grief or commemoration for the partition, reminding people of the huge human cost, up to 2 million dead, 20 million displaced. These are presented as ways to address the historical narrative.
This historical critique then logically leads to the main proposal, a new constitution. The argument starts with the idea that constitutions shouldn't be static. Right.
Absolutely fundamental for the source. A constitution is a living agreement. It has to evolve with technology, ideas, governance needs, not just amendments, but potential renewal.
It mentions historical figures on this.
Yes, James Madison's worry about overly complex laws, and Thomas Jefferson's idea that constitution should maybe lapse every 19 years or so.
The earth belongs to the living.
That's the quote. The source also points to examples like France, with its multiple constitutions, or Chile's current process as precedents for complete overhauls.
And the core concept for this proposed new Indian constitution.
They call it a Dharmic Democratic System, or DDS. The aim is to blend ancient Indian laws, ethics, dharma, with modern democratic principles, to create something more authentically rooted.
Okay, let's get into some key features described by the source. The electoral process sounds quite different.
Very different. Universal suffrage at 18 stays. But a big change is the none of the above option and how it counts.
How does it count?
To win, a candidate needs over 50% of the votes of all registered voters, not just those who voted for a candidate. So none of the above votes and even non-voters who are registered count towards that denominator.
Wow. That's a high bar. What if no one reaches it?
Re-election between the top two. If still no one gets over 50% of registered voters, the PM or CM fills the seat.
Requiring a majority of registered voters fundamentally changes things. What about accountability? Term limits.
Strong proposals here. Anti-deception measures. Candidates need detailed manifestos, false promises, disqualification, a right to recall. If officials fail promises or lie, 33% of voters can initiate a recall.
And term limits.
A strict cumulative limit. 15 years total in any elected office, local, state, federal, across your entire career. Max 15 years as MP, max 15 as MLA, but the combined total can't exceed 15.
That's a hard stop on political careers. What about fundamental rights and duties?
Many familiar rights are there. Equality before law, equal protection, freedoms of speech, assembly, movement, profession, life, liberty via due process, religion.
Yeah, makes that out.
The right to justice is stress equal for rich and poor, independent law enforcement and judiciary, severe penalties for misconduct in the system, and social justice.
Yes.
Protection against discrimination based on financial status, race, gender, disability. But significantly, affirmative action is proposed to be based only on financial marginalization, regardless of other identities.
Purely economic criteria for affirmative action.
Interesting. And duties. Respecting the Constitution, symbols, unity, integrity. Promoting harmony. Critically protecting the environment. Rivers, air, land are specifically mentioned. Civic participation, ethics.
How's the governance structure outlined?
A ceremonial president, elected by an electoral college. Parliament is called the Supreme Council.
And the executive.
This is a big change. The Prime Minister is the executive head, elected directly by the people nationwide. They then form the cabinet. Same at the state level. Chief Minister, directly elected by state voters, forms the cabinet, max 3 terms or 15 years total in that role.
Direct election of executives. Major shift.
Yeah.
And local government.
Panchayats, urban bodies, would be significantly empowered, constitutionally backed. An independent judiciary remains key, with the Supreme Court at the top.
The source also emphasizes the center's role in citizen protection.
Yes, explicitly. The central government would have the duty and power to protect any vulnerable citizen anywhere, overriding local state authority if needed. Article 26I specifically mandates the center protect women's dignity, life, well-being.
Okay, let's dive into the legal system and police reforms. The source details these a lot, especially in the appendices, reforming the IPC-BNS first.
The source argues even the new Bharat BNS needs more reform to be truly people-centric, transparent, accountable, aligned with rights. Judicial review stays.
And the link to tradition.
Crucially, the source says the reform must draw from India's historical legal traditions. It outlines steps, committee review BNS, new framework, draft a new code with diverse input, public consultation, training, key principles, human rights, fairness, accountability, Indian tradition, public safety.
And then there's this detailed proposal for a police of police, the POP system, in Appendix Legs.
Yeah. The source argues strongly for this. Why? Because of the gap between law and reality, citizens feeling vulnerable, police corruption, tyranny.
It cites data.
Yes, NCRB stats on custodial deaths 1,723 in 2019 in one part, 1,731 in 2020 in the appendix itself. It also mentions broader corruption ministers, officials, bankers, doctors, citing a Transparency International stat about bribes for basic services.
So the POP is the proposed fix.
Exactly. A totally independent body overseeing police, judiciary, bureaucracy, free from political, financial, any outside influence.
Key features.
Independent oversight, fixed non-renewable terms for its officers, diverse recruitment, law, human rights, finance, investigative journalism, secure comms, strong whistleblower protection, constitutional backing. It serves at the pleasure of the citizens.
Contrasting with current issues.
Yes, like lack of oversight, political interference. It notes reforms recommended in the Prakash Singh case, 2006, are still largely unimplemented.
Appendix 4 is equally forceful on violence against women.
Extremely forceful. It proposes declaring rape a socio-medical pandemic needing an urgent wartime-level response.
And reiterates the PM's duty.
Yes, the constitutional mandate to protect women, failure being a grave dereliction of duty.
And making rape a federal crime. Why?
For consistent treatment nationwide, regardless of status, and critically, to allow the central government to intervene directly.
Overriding local issues.
Yes, overriding potential local corruption or political interference hindering justice.
What are some of the practical steps proposed? Radical ones.
A central database for real-time, transparent reporting on rape cases. Reports only printable centrally. A dedicated rape prevention and mitigation army, RPMA team, from the Home Ministry, intervening within 24 hours.
Treated like capital crimes.
Yes. And redefining juveniles in rape cases as under 12.
And these wartime trials.
That's the source's term. Highly expedited, secure trials. Court near the victim, trial within 7 days of arrest identification. No bail. Location private, no media near witnesses.
Resources.
Wartime funds, including air support with medical forensic gear, the RPMA trial team, judges, civilians, vetted activists, academics, crucially with no ties to the state involved, strict conduct rules, protection for everyone involved using central forces, and finally a covert oversight team, OSRPMA, to watch the trials.
Incredibly specific, assertive proposals. The source sees this whole model having wider relevance.
Yeah. It suggests this dharmic democratic system, blending heritage and modern ideas, could be a model for other nations wanting to move beyond frameworks derived from, say, the Magna Carta, and build something more rooted in their own history.
So we've gone from the critique, through the history, the indigenous view, to this very detailed new proposal with its sweeping reforms. Let's wrap up with the source's core argument for why this kind of renewal is necessary.
The source really hammers this home. A constitution isn't static, it's a living agreement. It must evolve with changing times, tech, ideas, governance. Periodic renegotiation and reaffirmation by the current generation is needed. A frozen constitution can't handle modern issues like AI or climate change.
This ties into generational equity.
Precisely. The argument that each generation has the right to shape its own social contract. Binding future generations to old philosophies is seen as undemocratic. Periodic overhauls give each generation a voice.
The source anticipates pushback, right?
Right.
About amending Article 368 or basic structure doctrine.
It does. On the basic structure, it argues for a dynamic view. Amending Article 368 for overhauls doesn't kill core principles. It strengthens them by allowing evolution. Core values can be protected in the new process. It cites the U.S. Constitution's amendments as precedent.
What about political resistance?
The source suggests regular reviews could actually strengthen federalism by giving states a voice. Transparency commissions, consultations, referendums can build consensus. Addressing regional issues could incentivize states. And it points to recent examples like GST or Article 370 abolition as proof that controversial changes are possible with leadership and public support.
And judicial hurdles?
The argument is that judicial views evolve too. A well-designed overhaul process could be legally sound, respecting basic principles. Judicial oversight could ensure fairness.
So, summing up the justification for periodic overhauls.
It creates a dynamic constitution, ensures true democratic renewal, empowers future generations, and, importantly for the source, honors India's own philosophy, which it sees as celebrating renewal and adaptability.
And the ultimate goal ties back to the start.
Exactly. A constitution reflecting the soul of Bharat, truly for the people, by the people, and to the people, where citizens are masters, leaders are caretakers.
We certainly covered a lot in this deep dive, exploring the source's sharp critique, its historical lens, the focus on indigenous traditions, and this incredibly detailed proposal for a new constitution with radical reforms.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it, about the origins, the effectiveness of India's framework, and this idea of whether a nation's core law should be periodically remade by the people living under it.
So as we finish, here's something for you, our listener, to reflect on, based on the source material. Consider Jefferson's idea. The earth belongs to the living. No generation binding the next forever. What does it mean for a constitution to be truly living, capable of renewal by its citizens?
And think about that balance, drawing strength from ancient roots, from history, while also adapting to the constantly shifting needs and hopes of people today. How does a nation strike that balance in its most fundamental document?
Something to ponder until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.